In the name of the one, holy, and undivided Trinity. Amen. Amen. Please be seated. Today is Transfiguration Sunday, a day we in the church remember on August 6th, which happens to fall on a Sunday this year. You can tell it's a special day because we have switched from green to white, and next week we'll be back to green. So an extra special thanks to our altar guild today. We are pausing from our regularly scheduled programming to have this special Transfiguration Sunday. But what does that mean? What is Transfiguration Sunday? As I was preparing for today, I realized that my brain was auto-translating Transfiguration Sunday to Transformation Sunday. And while these words are certainly related, I was missing an important part of the day by not accurately realizing what it meant. Transformation means to make a thorough or dramatic change in form or appearance or character. But transfiguration means a complete change of form or appearance into a more beautiful or spiritual state. A more beautiful or spiritual state. Now that is an important distinction. So once I got that straightened out, I was left with another question. Who is transfiguring? Now the obvious answer is Jesus. We hear, and while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became a dazzling white. But the more I read the gospel, the less I became convinced that that was the entire story. Jesus is the Emmanuel, God with us. Is it possible for God to become more beautiful and spiritual than God already is? Jesus is and always was God made human, fully divine, walking among us. Can Jesus become more beautiful and spiritual? I'm not sure. So I'm less convinced that only Jesus was transfiguring that day, being somehow made more holy than he already was, and more convinced that Peter, John, and James were also transfigured that day. While it's not possible for God to be made more holy, it is possible for us, for humans, to be made more spiritual. Here, the disciples are having their eyes opened to see Christ's full divinity, finally being able to see who Jesus had been the entire time. We hear that they saw his glory. As their hearts were transfigured, they were able to hear, "This is my son, the chosen, my chosen. Listen to him." James, John, and Peter had been following Jesus for years. They had been living, eating, praying, and learning from him this whole time. But it took climbing up a mountain and this mystical experience for them to finally see him in his true form, to see him in full divinity, to see God made human. Just as the disciples were made more beautiful and spiritual that day, we are also called to transfigure. When we live into the lives God has called us to, we will be transfigured. And because God has made each of us so uniquely different, what that looks like will look different for each of us. There have been many times in my life when I had been 100% sure that in that moment I would feel different. When I turned 13 and became a teenager. When I turned 18 and was officially an adult. When I was ordained. When I was married. When I became a mother. I had no doubt in my mind that I would wake up, that I would become a new person in an instant. That I would wake up that morning being the old Anne and go to bed that night as an entirely different person. And each time I was taught the lesson that no matter where I am or what happens to me, I will always feel like Anne. Over the years, I can see that I have grown into and continue to grow into these roles, but there is no instant change for me. And I think the same is true of my experience in my Christian faith. My baptism, confirmation, and ordination. My years of coming to know Jesus and Christ's church. The years of learning what it means to be a child of God. I have never experienced an instant change, a moment of total transfiguration. It seems my transfiguration moments are slower moving than we hear about today. I think we need to remember that when we hear about the disciples' transfiguration experience. Certainly, these instantaneous changes are possible. Many people have experienced them. Maybe you have, but I haven't, at least not yet. God works in us and through us so many different ways. We will all experience God differently. Every transfiguration experience, no matter how quick or how slow, is no less profound. As long as it leads us to knowing God more fully, seeing God more truly, becoming closer to our Creator, then our transfigurations are in process. But it must also be noted that transfiguration does not come easy. Just like the disciples had to climb a mountain to be changed, we also have to work to be changed. As Christians, we are called to look to Christ as our example for how to live. We are called to live our lives to become more like Christ. Prayer, Bible studies, being in relationships, working for justice, loving all people. This is all spiritual work that leads to spiritual change. We cannot expect to simply come to church once a week and be transfigured. Faith is a lot more than a once-a-week check-in. It is daily, hourly, sometimes minute-by-minute work. Climbing that mountain is making everything we do an act of prayer. It is actively living out our lives as God has called us to live, which means first doing the work of figuring out that calling and then living it. Being a Jesus follower is often a lot of work. Transfiguring, making a complete change of form or appearance into a more beautiful or spiritual state, is work. And this is more than work each of us is called to do as individuals. While throughout our lives we will all transfigure as individuals, we are also called to transfigure as communities. We are called to change the world. What would it look like if our church became a more beautiful and spiritual state? What would it look like if Beltsville did, if Maryland did, if the United States did, if the world did? What does a more beautiful and spiritual world look like? And how do we get there? When the disciples were transfigured, they were finally able to see Jesus for who he really is, for who he had always been. One sign that we have experienced transfiguration is we will be able to see God. We will be able to see God in the world around us. We will be able to see God in nature. We will be able to see the image of God in ourselves. And we will be able to see God in others, in our friends, our neighbors, in strangers, and even our enemies. And as always, we are not called to do this work alone. We are called to it as a community. We are called to it with Jesus by our side. Every week when we come to the altar to have communion, to partake in Jesus' body and blood, we are able to internalize this blessing and companionship. Every week, we are able to experience a small transfiguration. So when you come up to communion today, let us all think about how God is transforming us, how God is working in us to become more like Jesus. What mountain is God directing us towards? How will you be transfigured today? Amen.